Okay. I want to show you some of the early sources about Hanukkah. We have 4 early sources about Hanukkah. The first one is Maccabees 1. There's also Maccabees 2, which is relatively early. 3 and 4 are later. Actually, Maccabees 3 and 4 seem to be taken from the Jewish historian Jason of Kyrene. But Maccabees 1 and 2 were, especially Maccabees 1, was written by somebody who lived very close to the Maccabean revolt, because every detail is given in that book. The book was originally written in Hebrew. We lost the original Hebrew because in general, Jews never took the Apocrypha very seriously as Holy Writ. And when we don't see the books as Holy Writ, we sort of lose them. But they were kept by the church in Latin, in Greek, and then retranslated. So we have Maccabees 1, we have Josephus, 200 years later in the 1st century, in his book, The Antiquities, Jewish Antiquities. We have, by the way, it's called the Scroll of Ta'anit, the Scroll of Fast Days, which means the national holidays during the Second Temple when you're not allowed to fast, because they are joyous days. It's just called the Scroll of Fast Days because you're not allowed to fast on those days. And then the 4th source that we have is actually Al Anisim, that little prayer that we insert in Birkat Hamazon. And the Shmona Esrei is an ancient prayer which goes back at least to the time of the Geonim in the 5th and 6th century, but possibly even before that. So those are the 4 early sources we have about Hanukkah. So let's just read the description and see what it says, okay? Anybody want to read Maccabees 1? Who likes to read?
Want me to read what you have up on the screen? Or
yes, please. Yes.
Okay.
From 36.
36. Okay. Then Judas and his brothers said, "Now that our enemies have been crushed, let us go up and purify the sanctuary and rededicate it." So the whole army assembled and went to Mount Zion. They found the sanctuary desolate, the altar desecrated, the gates burnt, weeds growing in the courts as in a thicket or on some mountain, and the priests' chambers demolished. Then they tore their garments and made great lamentation. They sprinkled their heads with ashes.
Right, which is a sign of mourning when you see the temple in Jerusalem destroyed. Okay.
Right.
And yeah.
And when the signal was given with trumpets, they
40.
cried out to heaven.
Wait, 40. And they prostrated themselves. And when the signal, was given by trumpets, they cried out to heaven. 41.
Right. Then Judas appointed men to attack those in the citadel while he purified the sanctuary. He chose blameless priests devoted to the law. These purified.
Blameless probably means pure priests or tzaddikim or righteous. Probably righteous priests, meaning those which were not Sadducees. Because you had, before the Hanukkah story, the Sadducees were in control of the temple, whereas Yehuda, the Maccabee, who was also a priest, was not of the same mind of the Sadducees. Okay, continue.
These purified the sanctuary and carried away the stones of the defilement to an unclean place.
All the stones that were used for idolatry were considered impure. Okay, 44.
They deliberated what ought to be done with the altar for burnt offerings that had been desecrated. They decided it best to tear it down, lest it be a lasting shame to them that the Gentiles had defiled it. So they tore down the altar. They stored the stones in a suitable place on the Temple Mount until the coming of a prophet who would determine what to do with them.
Because they didn't know, because an altar that was used for the service of God, you're not supposed to really destroy it. So they put it aside. Yeah. Then they took uncut stones.
Yes, then they took uncut stones according to the law and built a new altar like the former one.
Cut stones is because the temple was never supposed to be, the stones weren't supposed to be cut with metal. That's what he means by uncut. So if you didn't have something non-metal to cut it with, you could only take uncut stones.
They also required the sanctuary and the interior.
Prepared the sanctuary.
Oh, yes. They also repaired the sanctuary and the interior of the temple and consecrated the courts. They made new sacred vessels and brought the lampstand, the altar of incense, and the table into
The
the temple.
lampstand means the menorah, the candelabra. Okay.
Then they burned incense on the altar and lighted the lamps on the lampstand.
Meaning the menorah, and this illuminated the temple.
Right. They also put loaves on the table and hung up the curtains. Thus, they finished all the work they had undertaken. They rose early in the morning of the 25th day of the 9th month, that is the month of Kislev, in the year 148.
It's 148, the Seleucid kingdom, but this is the 25th day of Kislev, which is the first day of Hanukkah. And offered sacrifices according to the law on the new altar for burnt offerings that they had made. Okay, then on the anniversary of the day on which the Gentiles had desecrated, on that very day, they dedicated with song, harps, and cymbals. This is very interesting. It says in the Maccabees that Hanukkah, the day of the dedication of the temple, was the exact same day that it was desecrated by the Seleucid Greeks, meaning years before. They picked that same day, obviously from the, I guess from a symbolic point of view, to rededicate it. All the people prostrated themselves, praised heaven who had given them success, and for 8 days they celebrated the dedication of the altar. They joyfully offered burnt offerings and sacrifices of deliverance and praise. They ornamented the facade of the temple with gold crowns and shields, repairs the gates and the priest's chambers. There was great joy among the people that the disgrace brought by the Gentiles was removed. And Judah and his brothers and the entire assembly of Israel decreed that every year for 8 days, from the 25th day of the month of Kislev, the days of the dedication of the altar were to be observed with joy and gladness on the anniversary. So if I were to ask you, according to Maccabees 1, what is the reason for Hanukkah? What's the answer?
Restoration
I guess,
of the temple.
Yeah, the
Restoration of the temple. Okay. Joel, you want to say something?
I just did. That was me.
Oh, that was you. Oh, I couldn't tell. Okay, restoration of the temple. By the way, you can see that in the name of Hanukkah. Hanukkah is like the Hebrew word Chanukot HaMizbeach, the dedication. Hanukkah means a dedication. It's either dedication of the altar, dedication of the temple, one of the two. But Hanukkah means a dedication. Chanukot HaMizbeach, right? Maoz Tzur, we say. So Hanukkah is a dedication. Now, it does say in Maccabees that they lit the candelabra, and this brought light into the temple. So that was considered also, I guess, an important moment. But you notice that there's something missing from the story. You notice?
Well, it didn't say very much about the war in the part that we just read.
Well, because I didn't read the whole book. There's plenty about the war. All of Maccabees 1 is about the war.
It didn't say much about the oil.
It didn't say anything about the oil.
Anything here.
Right. But it did say that they illuminated the menorah, and they made it sound like that was a moment. You know, and the more menorah was lit and lit up the chamber, that was a moment that people remembered. It does say that. Okay, now let's look at another document 200 years later, which is Josephus Flavius. Okay, this is the Book of Antiquities, Book 2, Chapter 7. Okay, I'll read. When therefore the generals of Antiochus's armies had been beaten so often, Judah assembled the people together and told them, after these many victories which God had given them, they ought to go up to Jerusalem, purify the temple, and offer the appointed sacrifices. But as soon as he and the whole multitude came to Jerusalem, they found the temple deserted. Its gates were burned down, plants growing in the temple of their own accord, on the account of its desertion. As you can see, this is very close to Maccabees 1, which is obviously where Josephus was looking. He and those that were him began to lament and were quite confounded at the sight of the temple. So he chose out some of the soldiers, gave them orders to fight against the guards in the citadel until he should have purified the temple, exactly what it says in Maccabees 1. Therefore, he carefully purged it, brought in new vessels, the candlesticks, the table of the showbread, the altar, which was made of gold. He hung up the veils of the gates, added doors to them, also took down the altar of the burnt offering and offered a new one of stone. Now, as it fell out that these things were done on the same day on which the divine worship was fallen off and reduced to profane and common use after 3 years' time. In other words, the dedication by Judah was exactly 3 years to the day of when the temple was defiled. For so it was that the temple was made desolate by Antiochus, and so continued for 3 years. This desolation happened to the temple in the 145th year on the 25th day of the month of Apelians, Kislev, and on the 153rd Olympiad, and it was dedicated anew on the same day, the 25th of the month of Apelians, on the 148th year of the Seleucid government, and on the 144th Olympiad of the Romans. And this desolation came to pass according to the prophecy of Daniel, which had given 408 years before, for he declared that the Macedonians would dissolve that worship. Okay, so of course, this is the Macedonians. He's with the Romans, so the Romans don't have to take blame for that. Okay. Now, Judah celebrated the festival of the restoration of the sacrifices of the temple for 8 days, and he admitted no sort of pleasure. He feasted upon very rich and splendid sacrifices and honored God, delighted with hymns and psalms. They were so glad of the revival of their customs that after a long time of intermission, they unexpectedly had regained the freedom of their worship. And they made it a law that they should keep this festival on account of the restoration of their temple for 8 days. From that time, we celebrate this festival and call it lights. We call it the Festival of Lights, Chag HaUrim. I suppose the reason was because this liberty beyond our hopes appeared to us, and therefore they give the name to the festival. And then Judah rebuilt the walls around the city, etc. According to Josephus Flavius, what is Hanukkah? Flavius gives a different reason than Maccabees 1, which he is, by the way, quoting, but his reason is different. Anybody pick it up? According to Flavius, what's the reason for Hanukkah?
Liberty.
Meaning?
That they won the war against the Greeks and took back.
No, that's Maccabees 1. That's not him. Let me read it again. You have to read what it says. They were so glad of the revival of their customs that after a long time of intermission, they unexpectedly regained the freedom of worship.
Well, liberty to be Jew.
Yes. He would definitely not write it was a battle for freedom, because now they're under another occupation, the Romans. The worst possible thing would be to describe Hanukkah as a war against the Seleucid government after the Romans just finished the war against the Jews. So Hanukkah was just transformed by the stroke of a pen into the festival where we celebrate our freedom of worship, that we can live as religious Jews. So it could be under the Roman occupation too. They can give us freedom of worship. Okay, with a stroke of a pen, he redefined Hanukkah. Hanukkah is not that we actually won the battle, we got Judea back and Jerusalem, and then rededicated the temple, etc., but it's the freedom for worship. Okay, and if Antiochus would have just known to give them freedom of worship, they never would have rebelled in the first place. Obviously, you have to understand, this is deliberate. he has to recoin Hanukkah because he's writing for the Romans. And he wants to make sure the Romans allow the Jews to keep Hanukkah. So Hanukkah is now the festival of the freedom of worship. Okay, so the first one to do this was Josephus in the 1st century. So what is Hanukkah?
Freedom of worship.
According to Josephus. Now let's read a third quote, which this is from the Talmud, Shabbat 21. The Talmud actually does something which is unusual for it, and it quotes the scroll of Ta'anit. The scroll of Ta'anit is, I told you, during the Second Temple, there were lots of festive days, usually battles that were won. And these days were days you were not allowed to fast. They were national holidays. It was the book of national holidays. Just like in Israel today, we have Yom Ha'atzmaut and Yom Yerushalayim and Yom HaShoah. They had a list of national holidays that were sanctioned by the government. Many of them during the time of the Hasmonean kingdom, like the day of Nicanor on the 12th of Adar, when they won the battle against General Nicanor. In there also, there's the description of Hanukkah, of course, which was the main one, and also Purim, by the way, which was even older, but it's in there also. The Talmud, by the way, says that after the destruction of the temple, the scroll of Ta'anit is no longer binding because all those national holidays are meaningless. Because we lost Jerusalem, so why celebrate all the national holidays of the Second Temple period? Except for, of course, Hanukkah and Purim, which were sanctioned by the rabbis. So the Gemara has a very strange thing. It asks the question, what is Hanukkah? Okay, what is Hanukkah? Very strange. There's no place the Talmud says, what is Passover? What is Shavuot? What is Hanukkah? And why are lights kindled on Hanukkah? That's actually Rashi. The Gemara answers, the sages taught in Gilat Tanit on the 25th day of Kislev. The day of Hanukkah, there are 8 days. You're not allowed to eulogize. You're not allowed to fast. What's the reason? When the Greeks entered the sanctuary, they defiled all of the oils that were in the sanctuary, and he adds a commentary by touching them. And when the Hasmonean monarchs overcame them and emerged victorious, they searched and found only 1 cruse of oil that was placed with the seal of the high priest. And that was sufficient oil to light for 1 day. A miracle occurred, and they lit for 8 days the menorah. The next year, the sages instituted these days, made them holidays with Hallel and Thanksgiving. And Thanksgiving is our Al Anisim prayer, which we have in Birkat HaMazon and the Shmona Esrei, the Al Anisim, right? That's called Thanksgiving, and that's why it's said in Modim, which means Thanksgiving. So, according to the scroll of Ta'anit, which is mentioned in the Talmud, what is the reason for Hanukkah? Nobody?
The miracle of the oil.
I didn't hear, I'm sorry. Lucia?
Yeah, according to them, it's the miracle of the oil. The fact that
Well, actually, both are mentioned here because look, let me read it again. When the Hasmonean monarchs overcame them and emerged victorious, they searched and found only 1 cruse of oil. In other words, en passant, sort of like as sideline, it says, yes, the Hasmoneans were victorious against the Seleucid, but then they found this 1 cruse of oil, etc. So when you read it, it sounds like the cruse of oil is the main thing, but they actually do say the Hasmoneans were victorious against the Seleucid government. It's almost like if I were to tell you the story like this. I'm telling you a story. I was walking down the street one day, and somebody told me that I had a somebody's coming towards me who looked exactly like Mike Tyson, and he looked really angry, okay? So then he started coming really closer, and he mistook me for somebody else, and I saw he wanted to beat me up. So, so what happened was Mike Tyson came right to me, and I beat him up, and then after I beat him up, I noticed there was a $100 bill that I picked up and put in my pocket, and it was such a wonderful thing that I found that $100 bill. Now, what would be your immediate reaction to that story? Would your first question be, how did you find the $100 bill? Or would your first question would be, you beat up Mike Tyson? Which would be the first question you would come to your mind? Obviously, number one, you beat up Mike Tyson? Forget about a $100 bill. Are you telling me you beat Mike Tyson? Okay. What is it? This little passage in the Talmud is saying these guerrilla warfarers, right? The Maccabees, a couple of hundred of them, brought the Seleucid Empire to their knees. And then they found this flask of oil, which had a little miracle that for 8 days, said, wait, what was the first thing you said? Who did they bring to their knees? Okay, it makes it sound like, okay, that happens all the time when you bring an empire to their knees, right? When a couple of guys get together from Modi'in and bring the Seleucid Empire to their knees, that's like the easy stuff. But the oil flask, now that was a miracle. Okay, I mean, when you read it, you realize how ironical it is to say such a thing. You know, when the Hasmonean monarchs beat the Seleucids, who are the Hasmonean monarchs? You know, it's like the story of one time on Yom Ha'atzmaut in the 1950s when Rabbi Herzog was the chief rabbi. So David Ben-Gurion, so Herzog gave a talk on Yom Ha'atzmaut, and he talked about the miracles of 1948. So Ben-Gurion came over and said, Rabbi Herzog, miracles, miracles. We had the Palmach, we had the Haganah. And so Herzog said, David, you're the biggest miracle. Whoever taught you how to be a general? So I'm just saying that, you know, the way it's brought down, the scroll of Ta'anit and the Talmud is very unusual. You know, if you actually read the story and they're poo-pooing the fact that the Hasmonean monarchs brought down the Seleucid government and making such a big deal of an oil flask, it's no wonder it's not that way in the book of Maccabees. Now, just to make my point even more clear, let's read source number 4. Source number 4 is a real rabbinic source. Excuse me, the scroll of Tani is also a rabbinic source. I'll talk about that. But here's a rabbinic source which was sanctioned by the rabbis to put in the Sidur. It's called Al Anisim. We say it 3 times a day on Hanukkah in the Shemona Esrei, and if every time you say Birkat HaMazon. So this is the sanctioned description of what Hanukkah is according to the prayer book. And this description was already well known in the time of the Geonim, already well known by the 8th century, and it's mentioned by Sadi Gaon in his Sidur in the 9th century, so it was already around. So let's read it. We thank you for the miracles, Al Anisim, for the redemption, for the mighty deeds, the wondrous acts, and the battles, Milchamot, that you did with our ancestors at this time. So let's figure out what the miracle is. In the days of Matityahu, the son of Yochanan, the great priest, he wasn't actually the high priest, the Hasmonean and his sons, the wicked Hellenic government rose up against your people to make them forget your Torah and violate your decrees. But in your abundant mercies, you stood by them. You waged their battle, defend their rights, avenge the wrongdoing. You delivered the mighty into the hands of the weak, meaning weak in numbers, the many into the hands of the few, the impure into the hands of the pure, the wicked into the hands of the righteous, the sinners in the hands of those who occupy themselves with Torah. You made a great and holy name for your world and effected a great deliverance and redemption for your people Israel. Then your children entered the shrine of your house. They cleaned the temple, they purified the sanctuary, they kindled the lights in your courtyard, and instituted 8 days of Hanukkah to give thanks and praise to your great name. This description of Hanukkah, is it the same description as Maccabees 1? Or is it the same description as Josephus? Or what's mentioned in Shabbat from Tani's scroll? What is it closest to from the other three sources? Out of the other three sources, Al-Anisim is the closest to which source?
Maccabees.
Maccabees 1, 100%. No mention of the oil flask. There's no emphasis on religious freedom. It's the whole package, okay, which is going on here. Definitely Maccabees 1. So, what's going on? Why, in the Talmud and Shabbat, are they bringing a source which emphasizes something else? Anybody have an answer? I'm sorry I'm doing this a little bit quickly because of our short amount of time, but can anybody give me an answer? If I were to summarize, it's something like this. Maccabees 1 describes the battle, describes the dedication of the temple and the altar, and basically says that Hanukkah is the 8 days because of this dedication. Josephus changes the narrative slightly, calls it the freedom of worship holiday, the holiday of lights. But he also doesn't mention the oil flask. The Talmud does mention the oil flask, does mention also the victory against the Seleucid, but mentions sort of like sidelines it. Apropos, they're also, we brought down the Seleucids, but then the big thing was the oil flask, okay? Which is very ironical. And then, of course, you have Al-Anisim, which is the official description of the Sidur, of the rabbinic description of Hanukkah, which echoes Maccabees 1, 100%. And despite the fact that we say this 3 times a day, every day of Hanukkah and Sidur, people always remember the story which is in the Talmud. So will the real Hanukkah stand up? What's the real Hanukkah? Anybody have an idea? Aviran, what do you think?
Well, you confuse me basically, but again, it's the idea of the big miracle that happened to the Jewish people.
Okay, I can barely hear you for some reason, but it's not very clear. Okay, let me just try to, because I have to recap, I have to sort of summarize because I don't have that much time. I have to do some deliveries this evening.
Does it have to do maybe with the spirituality, like behind the miracles? They try to emphasize on that. I don't know.
Yes, but it also has to do with what Avi was saying earlier. Avi Mizrahi, you were saying something earlier. Tell me again. I forget it. Okay, I'll give my summary, okay? The problem is like this. Hanukkah, as Maimonides says, the victory of Judah Maccabee over the Seleucid Empire was mind-boggling. I can tell you the Jews themselves were probably in shock. Remember, there are a lot of Hellenists among the Jews who didn't have a problem with the Seleucid government. So I'm sure they were the first ones who were in shock. Secondly, things like that don't happen. You don't have guerrilla warfares against empires, and then they grab a piece of land, the empire says, okay. That just doesn't normally happen. And who are these guys? Whoever taught them to be soldiers in the first place? You have a battle that rages for about almost 3 years, 2.5 years, and then they recapture Jerusalem, take over the autonomy. Now, there were political reasons why this happened. There always are political reasons. There was a battle which opened up a new front in the middle of the Hanukkah story. There was a new front of the Persians against the Seleucid Empire. So the Seleucids didn't really have time to waste on Judah Maccabee and his guerrilla warfare, because it's very hard putting down guerrilla warfare. So they decided to make a truce. you get the autonomy, but you still pay taxes to us and you're loyal to us. You know, they had to cut their losses because they needed all their troops to fight the Persians at that point. But from the point of view of the people living in Judea, this was shocking. Okay, it's like nobody expected that outcome. Just like nobody expected the state of Israel in 1948. Definitely not during the Holocaust. Okay, nobody thought the Jews would have a country 3 years later. I can tell you that even Herzl probably never thought that it would actually happen, even though he actually wrote something like that in his diary originally. But I mean, it was mind-boggling, the Hanukkah story, for people living at that time. So when you have such a mind-boggling story, any miracles which happen to be recorded or ever, these are totally secondary. You know, there are so many stories that I've heard from soldiers from the 6-Day War, from the 73 War, crazy things that happened, how they survived. Miraculous sounding stories. But everybody knows that the 6-Day War is about the capturing of Jerusalem, right? Nobody would think that these individual stories or whatever they are the main thing about the 6-Day War. Just like nobody would think that the War of Independence was about what happened to the Haganah or the Palmach. It's about Jewish sovereignty being reestablished. It's obvious. So in the Hanukkah story, whether there were miracles or not, that was totally secondary. I told you, it's like bumping into Mike Tyson. He's attacking you, and you give him one zap, and he's down. And then you find the $100 bill. Nobody's going to ask you about the $100 bill. They're going to want to know what happened with Mike Tyson. Okay, how's that possible? The guy's the heavyweight champion, and you just hit him, and he's down. When did you learn how to box? So the Maccabees story is really a mind-boggling story that I'm sure for years and years people were talking about. In fact, even the Bar Kokhba rebellion of 132 to 135, their slogan was, remember the Hasmoneans. If they could do it then, we could do it again, which didn't work. And the Romans knew that that was a slogan, and therefore they cruelly put down the Bar Kokhba revolt just to make sure that nobody had the wrong ideas about them. They weren't going to be like the Seleucids. But the Hanukkah story is really an amazing story in that sense. So obviously Maccabees 1 is going to put that in the foreground. But of course, the religious aspect too, rededicating the temple, because Judaism is not just a nationality, it's a people with a belief system. That's obvious for people in antiquity. The national, the religious goes hand in hand. But hey, you didn't need a miracle to realize that it's a miracle. On Purim, there's no miracle. Everybody knows it's a miracle. We say Al Anisim. Because Haman wanted to have us killed, didn't happen. That was pretty good. The guy was second in command. And then Mordechai becomes second in command. That's a miracle. So as Jews, we see lots of things of miracle in history. We don't need something supernatural to justify it. The question really is, why then did the Talmud have to put the scroll of Ta'anit? It's actually one version of the scroll of Ta'anit. There are 3 versions. But why did the Talmud put that version of the scroll of Ta'anit at the forefront of Hanukkah? I think the answer is obvious. Hanukkah is a national holiday and a religious holiday. We won back our autonomy from the Seleucids. Whichever way it happened, there's always politics too. There's always diplomacy. We were able to get Jerusalem back. It was a pagan city. We were able to get the temple back. We were able to reinstate ourselves. This was unbelievable. But now, the Talmud being written in Babylonia in the 3rd and 4th century, Jerusalem is destroyed already by the Romans. It's a pagan city again. The Jews are leaving Israel in general. They're going towards Babylonia. The Bar Kokhba revolt was a disaster. So what are we going to do? Celebrate Hanukkah as a national holiday? If God forbid there was no state of Israel today, would Jews still celebrate Yom Ha'atzmaut in New York or in Belgium? Or in England, or in France? Hanukkah was the national holiday. It was like the Yom Ha'atzmaut. of the Second Temple period. It was the rededication of Jewish autonomy and Jewish worship, which went hand in hand. But what did it mean to a Jew who was sitting in Babylonia with Jerusalem destroyed? The rabbis had to salvage Hanukkah because Hanukkah was in danger of becoming meaningless to the Jew in Galut. So they didn't change the story, they just changed the emphasis. They didn't say that the Hasmoneans didn't overcome the Seleucid kingdom and reestablish themselves. They did. But they put the emphasis on the oil flask, meaning the religious battle, keeping your faith with the tides of change, which becomes a message which is pertinent to the Jew living in the diaspora. That's all the Talmud did. They refocused the emphasis to make it something where the Jews in Babylonia would be able to be proud of Hanukkah and learn something from it for their situation. And that's what the oil flask did. But now that we're back in the state of Israel, and we have again Jewish autonomy, and we have again freedom of worship in Israel, we can now refocus on the original meaning of Hanukkah, which was Jewish autonomy, dedication of Jerusalem, dedication of the temple, and again, the freedom of worship too, all goes hand in hand. But it was a full package. The Talmud had to put an emphasis on one thing. Josephus also put an emphasis on one thing, but the original is both. As somebody said earlier, if you don't understand that it's both, then you don't understand. A Jewish Day of Independence is not just national, it's national and religious, because as a people, we are a people and we have a belief. It goes hand in hand. As Ruth says in the book of Ruth, Amech ami ve'Elohayech Elohai. Your people is my people and your God is my God. That's what it means to be a Jew. We're both a people and a belief system that goes hand in hand. So basically what was happening in the Hanukkah story with the oil flask, I'm not saying it didn't happen, but the point was that first of all, miracles are not reasons for holidays. And secondly, the miracle would have been shadowed by what actually happened historically for the people living at that time. Because the real miracle was this Seleucid Empire said, okay, to Judah Maccabee, you can have the autonomy. That doesn't usually happen. Remember what Charles de Gaulle did when the Algerians wanted autonomy. First, he decimated them, okay, in an all-out battle, and made them into a punching bag so that they lost, and they knew that they lost. And then he said, okay, I will give you an autonomy on my terms. That's what empires do. That's not what happened here. Okay? So it really was a miracle for the people living at that time. So this is what I want to say in a nutshell, that the Hanukkah story in its origin really was a national day, but national day for us, a Yom HaAtzmaut, from the point of view that Hasmonean thinking, is not just autonomy. It's also to perpetuate all the goals and the beliefs of the Jewish people in their land. It's not just the land, it's everything together. It's the land, the autonomy, and the rededication of the temple, because we're like a body and a soul. The national entity is in order for the spiritual tradition and direction to flourish. And this is the way they understood it, and this is the way we should understand Hanukkah too. Today, it was the Jewish National Day, but it teaches us a lot of what a Jewish National Day is supposed to be. It's not just we won the war and we have a country, but what is going to be the spiritual direction of that country. So something about Hanukkah can teach us a lot about what our Yom HaAtzmaut really should be all about too. That was my point for this evening. Any questions? She'elot, question?
I agree 100%.
Oh, okay. Thank you. What would I do if you didn't agree?